Mercy Robinson, a young woman bound by the chains of 1837 Charleston, was given a simple task: to light the candles at St. Michael's Church. She didn't know that the wicks would catch, but the flames would refuse to burn, casting a cold, ghostly light that offered no warmth. She didn't know that by morning she would be gone, leaving behind only a folded shawl and a mystery that would haunt the city for a century. As she stepped into the silent church that evening, a single prayer echoed in her heart, a desperate plea for a sign in the oppressive darkness. She had no idea that her prayer was about to be answered. Before we carry on, please hit the subscribe button to make my day, and let me know where you are watching from in the comments. The evening descended upon Charleston like a damp shroud, a cold mist rolling in from the Cooper River to slick the cobblestone streets until they gleamed like polished jet under the gas lamps. The air, thick with the scent of sea salt and the pervasive aroma of wood smoke from 1,000 hearths, carried a chill that burrowed deep into the bones. Above the tightly packed houses and walled gardens, the steeple of St. Michael's Church speared the bruised twilight, an imposing monument of white authority and divine judgment. It was here, in the shadow of this grand edifice, that Mercy Robinson walked, her steps quiet and measured against the growing dark. In her early 20s, Mercy possessed a quiet strength that resided not in her physical frame, which was slender and worn by labor, but in the deep, contemplative gaze of her dark eyes. They were eyes that had seen too much of hardship and too little of kindness, yet they held a stillness, a profound depth that seemed to absorb the world without being consumed by it. Her hands, though calloused and scarred from tasks no young woman should have to endure, moved with a gentle, deliberate grace. She carried the heavy, invisible burden of her family, a mother and 2 younger siblings still bound to the whims of the master on a rice plantation just outside the city, a weight that shaped her every thought and prayer. Tonight, a peculiar duty had fallen to her. The church sexton, a portly white man named Jebediah, was down with a fever, and his wife, who oversaw the house where Mercy served, had tasked her with lighting the candles for the evening service. It was a duty usually reserved for a white man, a position of minor but visible trust within the church. For Mercy, the assignment was a confusing mixture of pride and a gnawing anxiety. St. Michael's was a place of contradictions. Its soaring ceilings and promises of eternal salvation offered a sliver of spiritual solace, a place where she could feel small before God rather than before man. But it was also the very symbol of the oppressive authority that kept her and her people in chains. Its pews filled each Sunday with the merchants, politicians, and plantation owners who were the architects of her bleak existence. Pushing open the heavy oak door, Mercy slipped inside, the vast, cavernous space swallowing the sounds of the street behind her. Her footsteps, soft as they were, echoed in the profound silence. The air inside was cool and still, heavy with the scent of old wood, melting beeswax, and the faint metallic tang of the collection plates. Fading light filtered through the towering stained glass windows, painting the stone floor in bruised jewel tones of sapphire, ruby, and violet. The camera of her memory panned across the empty pews, each one a silent testament to the rigid hierarchy of this world. The front rows reserved for the wealthiest families, the rear for the lesser merchants, and the cramped, uncomfortable gallery high above for the enslaved. She moved with a practiced reverence, a ghost in this holy place. Her first stop was the sacristy, where the candles were kept. They were long, elegant tapers of bleached beeswax, their scent clean and sweet. She gathered a bundle in her arms, along with a spill for lighting. Then, her solemn procession began. She moved from one candelabra to the next, her movements precise and unhurried. At each station she would wipe down the brass, replace the stubs, and fit a fresh taper into the holder. It was a ritual, and in its repetition, she found a strange comfort. As she worked, her mind, usually a whirlwind of worry for her family, settled into a quiet hum of prayer. It was not a formal prayer, with folded hands and bowed head, but an internal monologue, a constant, flowing conversation with a God she hoped was listening. She did not pray for freedom, for that felt too vast. Instead, she prayed for a sign, a glimmer of hope, a small token from the divine to show that she was not forgotten, that her suffering was not meaningless. She prayed for the strength to endure, for the safety of her mother, for a future where her sister might know a life better than her own. The camera of her soul followed her as she tended to each candle, her hands steady, her focus absolute, the feel of the cold stone beneath the thin soles of her shoes, the waxy smoothness of the candles, the way the last vestiges of daylight caught the gold thread on the altar cloth. All of it became part of her prayer. She was a part of this place, and yet utterly separate from it. She was essential to its function tonight, yet invisible to its congregation. This paradox was the very essence of her life. Finally, only one candle remained, the single, thick candle on the altar itself. It was the largest, the most important, the one that symbolized the light of Christ. With a deep breath, she lit her spill from a nearby lamp and approached the altar. The small flame danced, casting a warm, flickering light on her face, illuminating the earnest set of her jaw and the deep pools of her eyes. She touched the spill to the thick black wick, and then something was wrong. The wick caught. It blackened and smoked, but there was no flame. Instead, a soft, ethereal glow began to emanate from the tip, a cold, white light that was utterly alien. It did not flicker or dance. It was perfectly still, a bead of pure luminescence that cast no heat and, strangely, no shadows. Mercy pulled the spill back, her heart beginning to hammer against her ribs. The spill's own flame seemed to shrink away, diminished by the impossible light on the altar. She stared, her mind struggling to comprehend what her eyes were seeing. Slowly, her gaze traveled around the church. Every single candle she had lit was doing the same thing. From every candelabra, every sconce, every holder, there issued the same silent, cold, unwavering glow. The air in the church grew heavy and still, the silence deepening until it felt like a physical pressure against her eardrums. The familiar, comforting scents of beeswax and wood smoke were gone, replaced by nothing, a complete absence of smell. It was as if the church had been scooped out of the world and placed in a vacuum. The next morning, the congregation arrived for the Sunday service, bundled in their finest coats and bonnets, their minds on scripture and the week's gossip. They were greeted not by the familiar warmth and light of a prepared church, but by a chilling stillness. The great oak doors were unlocked, swinging open to reveal a scene of profound strangeness. The church was empty, not just of the sexton or the early arriving organist, but of all life. The air was cold, colder than the misty morning outside, and silent, and the candles, every single one, were still burning. They burned with that same strange, cold light, a ghostly glow that illuminated the cavernous space in a flat, shadowless luminescence. Whispers erupted among the parishioners, spreading like a contagion. "It's witchcraft," a woman hissed, pulling her children close. "A bad omen," a merchant muttered, his eyes wide with superstitious fear. They saw that the pews were pristine, the floors swept, everything in its place, except for the one thing that mattered. Mercy Robinson was nowhere to be found. Then, someone pointed towards the altar. There, lying perfectly centered upon the rich velvet cloth, was Mercy's shawl. It was a simple woolen garment, coarse and gray. A thing of little value, but it was neatly, almost lovingly, folded into a perfect square, a final, silent statement in the heart of the impossible scene. The church rector, Reverend Alistair Blackwood, pushed his way through the murmuring crowd. He was a stern, imposing figure, a man whose authority was rarely questioned. He strode down the central aisle, his face a mask of controlled disbelief. "Silence," he commanded, his voice echoing in the unnaturally quiet space. "There will be a rational explanation for this." But as he drew closer to the altar, as he felt the profound, unnatural cold emanating from the flameless candles, a tremor ran through his hand. His own fear was a palpable thing, a cold knot in his stomach that threatened to undo his carefully constructed composure. The central mystery was established, born in the eerie glow of the flameless candles and sealed by the disappearance of an enslaved girl. The oppressive social structure of 1837 Charleston, a world of masters and slaves, of rigid order and unspoken cruelties, had just been fractured by an event that defied all its laws. The supernatural had arrived, not in a clap of thunder or a burst of fire, but in a silent, cold, and terrifying light, leaving behind only a folded shawl and a question that would hang in the air for years to come. Where was Mercy? The initial shock that had seized St. Michael's congregation curdled into a city-wide malaise. The strange tale of the flameless candles and the vanished slave girl became the currency of Charleston's parlors and its back alleys. A story traded with a shudder and a whisper. The initial chaos gave way to the lumbering, methodical process of officialdom. The investigation, such as it was led by two men who embodied the city's divided soul. Reverend Alistair Blackwood, a man of God increasingly besieged by doubt, and Sheriff Brody, a man of law who believed in nothing he could not clap in irons. They met in the rector's study, a room that was usually a sanctuary of quiet contemplation, lined with leather-bound books that smelled of dust and decaying paper. Today, it felt like a cage. A thin gray light filtered through the window, illuminating the swirling smoke from the sheriff's pipe. Brody was a bull of a man, with a florid face and hands like cured hams. He slouched in a delicate chair that groaned under his weight, his pragmatic skepticism a palpable force in the room. "It's a runaway, Alistair," Brody said, his voice a low rumble. He tapped his pipe against the side of a porcelain dish, scattering ash, plain and simple. The girl saw an opportunity and she took it. The rest of this business with the candles, it's just window dressing. A clever trick to throw us off the scent. Reverend Blackwood stood by the window, his back to the sheriff. He stared out at the churchyard, where the ancient oaks dripped with Spanish moss like the beards of old forgotten prophets. A trick, Sheriff? I have had 3 different men attempt to extinguish them. A snuffer does nothing. Water thrown upon the wicks turns to steam with a hiss, but the light remains. We even tried smothering one with a wet sack. The glow persisted, visible right through the canvas. This is not a trick, Brody grunted, a sound of profound disbelief. Phosphorus, or some other chemical nonsense. These people have their ways, their little folk magics. She probably spent a week brewing it up, the shawl on the altar. Pure theater, meant to make us think she was taken, spirited away by angels or demons. He chuckled, a dry, humorless sound. She's halfway to the Free States by now, I'd wager. The rector turned, his face etched with a weariness that went beyond lack of sleep. And what of her family, Sheriff? I am told you paid them a visit. His voice was tight, a carefully controlled instrument of reproach. The sheriff's visit to the slave quarters had been an exercise in futility and casual cruelty. He had tramped through the damp, packed earth lanes between the small, rough-hewn cabins. His presence alone a form of intimidation. Mercy's mother, Hattie, had stood before him, her face a mask of grief, her 2 younger children clinging to her skirts. Her eyes, so like Mercy's, held a deep, guarded sorrow, but also a flicker of something else, a wary intelligence that the sheriff mistook for cunning. They know nothing, Brody said with a dismissive wave of his hand. Or they're pretending they don't. Cried and carried on, the mother did. Said her daughter was a good girl, pious, loved the church more than anything. He took a long draw from his pipe. They hide things, Alistair. It's in their nature, a closed-off little world. They have their own stories, their own secrets. She could be hiding in the very next cabin, and they'd all swear on a stack of Bibles they hadn't seen her. The enslaved community was indeed a world unto itself, and in the wake of Mercy's disappearance, it had drawn its curtains tight. The sheriff's questions were met with downcast eyes, shaking heads, and murmured professions of ignorance. They shared stories of Mercy's kindness, her gentle hands that could soothe a fevered child, her low, sweet voice humming hymns as she worked. They spoke of her piety, her deep and abiding faith that seemed so at odds with her station in life. But of the other things, the things they truly believed, they said nothing. They did not speak of the old spirits that walked the land, of the whispers of ancient African magic that survived the brutal passage across the sea. They did not share their own theories, that Mercy had not run away, but had been called away, that the strange light in the church was not a chemical trick, but a sign, a portal to a world unseen by their masters. To speak of such things to a man like Sheriff Brody would be to invite ridicule at best and violence at worst. Their grief was a shield, their silence a fortress. Meanwhile, the story of the flameless candles spread through the city like a fever. In the bustling city market, amidst the cacophony of vendors hawking fish and produce, the scent of spices and sweat and sawdust, the tale was on everyone's lips. White merchants and their wives spoke in hushed, excited tones, their fear mingled with a titillating sense of the macabre. Witchcraft, they'd say, their eyes wide. The devil's work, right in Street Michael's. The disappearance of an enslaved girl was a footnote, a minor detail in the much more thrilling narrative of a supernatural infestation. For them, it was a ghost story to be savored, For the enslaved and the free black people who navigated the periphery of the market, the story was different. They spoke in low, urgent tones, their conversations punctuated by anxious glances over their shoulders. They saw not the devil, but something else, something older and more profound. They saw power, a power that defied the master's world. And they saw hope, terrifying and fragile. It was here, near a stall selling woven sweetgrass baskets, that a new figure entered the unfolding drama. Her name was Sarah, a free woman in her late 50s, whose face was a beautiful map of wrinkles, each line a story. She was a respected elder, a keeper of the old traditions, a woman who knew the language of herbs and roots, of signs and portents. She moved with a quiet dignity, her gaze missing nothing. She listened to the whispers, her expression unreadable. She heard the white folks talk of devils and the black folks talk of spirits, and she knew the truth lay somewhere in between, in a place the sheriff's laws and the rector's prayers could not reach. The official investigation, as Brody had predicted, stalled. There were no witnesses, no signs of a struggle, no ransom note. The runaway theory was the simplest, the most convenient. It required no one to question the order of things, no one to confront the impossible light that still burned, day and night, within Street Michaels. The sheriff, under pressure from the city's mayor to quell the unsettling rumors, wrote up his report. Mercy Robinson, a slave girl, had absconded. The case was, for all intents and purposes, closed. This decision sent a ripple of quiet fury through the enslaved community. Their frustration and anger, long suppressed, simmered beneath the surface. They had known the white authorities would fail them. They always did. Justice was a commodity they could not afford. That evening, as dusk settled over the city, Sarah made her way to the small cabin where Hattie grieved. She did not knock, but entered softly, a comforting presence in the dim, smoky room. She carried a small bundle of dried herbs. Hattie looked up, her eyes red-rimmed and exhausted. "They ain't looking for her no more," Hattie whispered, her voice raw. "They say she run off." "She ain't run off," Sarah said, her voice calm and steady as a river. "And we ain't gonna stop looking." She sat down beside Hattie, taking her worn, calloused hand. The men with their laws and their books, they can only see what's in front of their eyes. They can't see the other world, the one that walks alongside ours. That light in the church, that ain't no trick. That's a door. And your mercy, she was called through it. Sarah's words were a balm to Hattie's wounded spirit. Here was someone who did not dismiss her fears, who did not treat her daughter's disappearance as an inconvenience. Here was someone who understood that there were powers in the world older and deeper than the master's whip or the sheriff's badge. "What can we do?" Hattie asked, a flicker of hope igniting in her weary eyes. "The first thing we do," Sarah said, her gaze firm, "is we listen. The spirits, they leave signs, the patterns in the water, the flight of a bird, the way the leaves fall. And those candles," she paused, her eyes seeming to look at something far away. "Those candles are talking. We just need to learn how to hear what they're saying." She opened her hand, revealing the bundle of herbs. There was mugwort for visions, yarrow for courage, and sweetgrass to call the ancestors. The official investigation was over. A new one, an investigation of the soul. of the spirit, of the hidden world that pulsed just beneath the surface of Charleston, was about to begin. The sense of injustice, sharp and bitter, was now tempered by a burgeoning resolve. The resilience of a people who had learned to survive in the cracks of a brutal world was gathering itself, coalescing around this wise woman and her ancient knowledge. They would find mercy, not with maps and magistrates, but with roots and rituals. In the city's underbelly, the world hidden from their master's eyes, the days that followed bled into a week, and St. Michael's Church, once the heart of Charleston's spiritual and social order, became its festering wound. The building was no longer a house of God. It was a place of ghosts. The flameless candles, burning with their cold, relentless light, had transformed it. The parishioners, who had once flocked to its pews for comfort and community, now hurried past on the other side of the street, their eyes averted as if the very sight of the steeple could invite a curse. Those brave or foolish enough to venture inside returned with stories that spread like wildfire, tales of eerie sounds and chilling visions that fed the city's growing hysteria. An organist, sent by the rector to try and bring some semblance of normalcy back to the sanctuary, fled after only 10 minutes, swearing he heard a woman's soft humming, a hymn with no words, echoing from the empty slave gallery. 2 vestrymen, tasked with measuring the candles to see if they were being consumed, reported seeing fleeting shapes in their peripheral vision, dark figures that vanished when they turned to look, leaving behind only a sudden drop in temperature. The church became a place of distorted shadows and profound, unnatural silence, a silence that seemed to listen. The cold light of the candles did not illuminate, it exposed, casting the familiar space in a flat, alien glare that made everything look unreal, like a memory of a place rather than the place itself. The services, when Reverend Blackwood insisted on holding them, were sparsely attended. A handful of the most devout huddled together in the front pews, their prayers sounding small and frightened in the vast, haunted space. Reverend Alistair Blackwood was a man adrift in the ruins of his own certainty. The church was his domain, his faith, the bedrock of his existence. Now, the church was possessed, and his faith was a crumbling cliff edge. He became a recluse in his own rectory, the books in his study offering no answers, only the dry rustle of irrelevant histories. Sleep offered no escape. It was there, in the defenseless hours of the night, that the haunting became personal. His dreams were plagued by mercy, but it was not the mercy he remembered, the quiet, deferential girl who cleaned the rectory and polished the silver. In his nightmares, she was terrifyingly magnificent. He dreamt he was standing at the altar of St. Michael's. The church plunged in absolute darkness. Then, one by one, the candles would ignite, not with their cold, white glow, but with roaring torrents of brilliant, golden fire. In the heart of this inferno stood Mercy, her simple dress replaced by a robe woven from shadow and starlight. Her eyes were not the soft, contemplative pools he remembered. They were burning nebulas, ancient and vast. She did not speak, but he heard her voice inside his mind, a voice that was not one, but many, a chorus of ancestors speaking through her. They spoke of forgotten histories, of stolen lives, of a power that had slept for generations and was now awakening. He would wake with a gasp, his heart hammering, the sheets soaked in a cold sweat. The spectral image of her power burned into the back of his eyelids. He began to see her not as a runaway, not as a victim, but as a powerful, otherworldly being, a prophetess or a demon. He could not tell which. His carefully ordered world, a world of scripture and sermon, of clear lines between good and evil, master and slave, was dissolving into a terrifying, incomprehensible chaos. His faith, once a fortress, was now a prison of questions. His sermons, when he could bring himself to deliver them, became erratic and frightening. He abandoned his prepared texts, his voice rising in the pulpit as he spoke of apocalyptic warnings, of the thinning veil between worlds, of judgment arriving not on a cloud, but in a silent, cold light. His congregation stared back at him, their faces a mixture of fear and pity. The rector, their shepherd, was becoming as haunted as his church. While the rector wrestled with his demons, Sarah began her own search, one that did not rely on sheriffs or sermons. She knew that to find mercy, she had to step outside the world of men and into the world of spirits. One night, when the moon was a sliver of bone in the black sky, she made her way deep into the cypress swamp, a place the white folk feared, a place they saw as a morass of disease and danger. To Sarah, and to the people who shared her knowledge, the swamp was a sanctuary. It was a place of ancient power, where the boundary between the physical and the spiritual was thin and permeable. She found a small clearing, where a massive live oak, draped in veils of Spanish moss, stood like a silent grandfather. The air was thick with the smell of damp earth, decaying leaves, and the sweet, heavy perfume of night-blooming jasmine. The sounds of the swamp were a symphony, the chirping of crickets, the deep guttural croak of bullfrogs, the sudden splash of something unseen in the dark water. Here, she prepared her ritual. She laid out a small, dark cloth on the ground and placed upon it the elements she had gathered: a bowl of fresh water from a hidden spring, a handful of black soil from a graveyard, a feather from a night heron, and the herb she had shown to Hattie. She lit a single small candle, its warm, flickering flame a stark contrast to the cold light that held St. Michael's hostage. Closing her eyes, she began to chant, her voice a low, melodic hum that blended with the sounds of the night. It was a call to the ancestors, a request for guidance, an opening of her spirit to the whispers of the other side. The air in the clearing grew still, charged with a palpable energy. The flame of her candle stretched upwards, burning tall and steady without a flicker. She felt their presence, the spirits of those who had come before, a great, silent host gathering in the darkness around her. She spoke to them of mercy, of the cold fire, of a community's fear and a mother's grief. She asked for a sign, a path. In the deep trance that followed, visions came to her, fragmented and swift. She saw mercy, not lost, but walking, her steps sure and steady, moving through a landscape of water and mist. She saw the flameless candles, but from a great height, as if she were looking down from the church ceiling. From this vantage, they were not random points of light. They were a pattern, a map of stars laid out across the floor of the church, and in the center of the pattern, where the altar candle burned, was a darkness, a void, a doorway. The vision shifted, and she heard a single word repeated like a drumbeat, a word in a language she had not heard since she was a child, a word that meant crossing or gateway. She came back to herself with a start, the candle flame now a normal, dancing light. She knew what she had to do. The candles were not just a sign, they were the directions. The next day, Sheriff Brody, with a sense of weary finality, pinned a notice to the board outside his office. The official investigation into the disappearance of the slave girl, Mercy Robinson, was closed. She was officially declared a runaway. The notice was a slap in the face to the enslaved community, a formal declaration of their invisibility. But for Sarah, it was merely the shedding of a useless skin. The true investigation had already begun. That night, armed with the knowledge from her vision, she gathered a small group in the deepest shadows of the slave quarters. There was Hattie, her grief now forged into a steely resolve. There was an old man named Cato, who had been born in Africa and still remembered the old ways. And there were two strong young men, brothers named Jacob and Elias, who had known Mercy since she was a child and loved her like a sister. "The sheriff has closed his books," Sarah said, her voice low but clear in the darkness. "They will not look for her. So we must." She told them of her vision, of the candles as a map, of the word that meant crossing. "The lights in that church are a constellation," she explained, her eyes burning with intensity. "They are a map of the swamp, a path to a hidden place, a gateway. Mercy was not taken. She was not stolen. She was called, and she is waiting for us to follow." Fear warred with hope on their faces. To defy the masters, to leave the plantation at night, to venture into the swamp on such a strange quest. It was a risk beyond measure, but the thought of Mercy, lost or transformed, was a greater fear. Hattie spoke first, her voice trembling but firm. "I will go. She is my child." Jacob and Elias nodded, their faces set. "We will go," Jacob said, "for Mercy." Cato, the old man, placed a hand on Sarah's arm. "It is a spirit walk," he said, his voice a dry whisper. "A dangerous path. But the ancestors have spoken through you. We must listen." And so, the decision was made. Under the cloak of a moonless night, while the city of Charleston slept, secure in its laws and its logic, a small, determined group prepared to slip away. They would take matters into their own hands, guided not by a sheriff's map, but by a constellation of impossible lights, launching their own rescue mission into the heart of the unknown. The rational worldview of the white authorities had declared the case closed, but for the enslaved community, the spiritual, intuitive world was just opening up, and they were about to step through the door. The journey began in the deepest hour of the night, a sliver of time between the last drunkard's stumble and the first baker's fire. Charleston was a city of walls, both physical and social, and they slipped through its cracks like smoke. Led by Sarah, the small group moved through the sleeping streets, their bare feet making no sound on the cobblestones. They were 5 shadows detaching themselves from the great dark mass of the enslaved, 5 souls risking everything on a faith that defied all logic. Hattie's heart was a frantic drum against her ribs, a wild rhythm of terror and hope. Beside her, Cato moved with the slow, sure gait of a man who had walked for a lifetime, his presence a calming anchor in the swirling sea of her fear. Jacob and Elias flanked them, their young bodies coiled with a protective tension. their eyes scanning every shadow, every alleyway. Sarah led the way, her gaze fixed on some invisible point ahead, navigating by memory and something more, a map etched not on paper, but on her soul. They left the last gas lamp behind, and the curated darkness of the city gave way to the absolute, living darkness of the swamp. The air grew thick and heavy, laden with the smell of decay and fecund life. The solid ground dissolved into a treacherous, sucking mire that pulled at their ankles with a greedy grip. Their journey was no longer a walk, but a struggle, a constant battle against the grasping roots and clinging mud. The sounds of the city were replaced by a new chorus, a symphony of the unseen. The high, buzzing drone of a million insects formed a wall of sound, punctuated by the deep, guttural croak of a bullfrog, the sudden, startling splash of a fish or a snake, the rustle of some nocturnal creature in the dense undergrowth. Every sound was a potential threat, every shadow a monster in waiting. Hattie stumbled, a cry catching in her throat as her foot sank deep into cold, viscous water. Instantly, Elias was there, his strong hand gripping her arm, pulling her back onto a firmer patch of ground. "Easy, Mother Hattie," he whispered, his voice a low rumble. "We are with you." She nodded, her breath coming in ragged gasps, her gratitude a warm flicker in the cold terror that gripped her. She was a house servant, her world defined by polished floors and linen sheets. This place, this primordial soup of life and death, was as alien to her as the moon. Only the image of Mercy, the memory of her daughter's face, kept her moving, placing one foot in front of the other. Sarah paused, holding up a hand. The others froze behind her, their senses straining in the darkness. She was looking up, not at the starless, cloud-covered sky, but at the canopy of cypress and oak. "The path changes here," she said softly. "The spirits of the water are strong. We must show respect." Cato stepped forward, his old eyes seeming to pierce the gloom. He reached into a small pouch at his waist and drew out a handful of dried tobacco leaves. He murmured a few words in the old language, a soft guttural prayer, and scattered the leaves onto the surface of the black, stagnant water before them. For a moment the leaves floated. Then, one by one, they sank, vanishing into the depths. "They have accepted the offering," Cato said, his voice filled with a quiet authority. "The way is open." As they moved forward, the oppressive atmosphere seemed to lighten, just a fraction. The path, though still treacherous, felt less menacing. Sarah acted as their guide, her knowledge of the spiritual world as vital as a compass. She would point to a twisted root that looked like a coiled snake and lead them around it. She would stop and listen, not to the sounds of the swamp, but to the silence behind them, before choosing a direction. She was reading the landscape, not as a physical place, but as a text written in a language of signs and portents. The group had to confront their own deep-seated fears. The stories they had been told since childhood about the haints and monsters that lived in the swamp. Jacob, for all his physical strength, flinched at the mournful call of a screech owl, his hand instinctively going to the hilt of the cane knife tucked in his belt. Hattie had to fight back waves of panic that threatened to overwhelm her, the darkness pressing in, feeling like a physical weight on her chest. They were entering a liminal space, a place where the veil between their world and the next was thin, and every step took them further from the familiar shores of reality. After what felt like an eternity, a change began to occur. A soft, pale light started to filter through the dense canopy above, a light that was not the moon, not the stars, not the dawn. It was a gentle, silvery luminescence, the same cold, shadowless light that burned in the candles at Street Michael's. The foul smell of the swamp began to recede, replaced by the scent of night-blooming flowers, a perfume so sweet and strange it seemed to belong to another world. The cacophony of insects and frogs softened, and underneath it, they could begin to hear a sound, a low, ethereal music that seemed to emanate from the very air around them, a humming that was felt in the bones as much as it was heard with the ears. They emerged from the oppressive tangle of cypress knees and hanging moss into a hidden sanctuary. It was a vast natural clearing, a perfect circle, as if drawn by a divine hand. The ground was not mud, but soft, springy moss that glowed with its own faint, phosphorescent light. Towering, ancient trees, of a kind none of them had ever seen before, formed the walls of this cathedral, their leaves not green, but a shimmering, iridescent silver, and the flowers, the source of the intoxicating scent, grew in impossible abundance, their petals unfolding in shades of deep violet and luminous white, each one emitting its own soft pulse of light. The air was still and filled with a profound peace, a sense of sacred power that made them all stop, their breath catching in their throats. They had crossed over. This was not the world of men. This was the other side, and in the center of the clearing they saw her. Mercy stood in the heart of the sanctuary, but it was a mercy transformed, a mercy they barely recognized. She was not in a trance. She was the trance. She was the focal point of a silent, swirling vortex of energy. The cold, pure light that filled the clearing emanated from her, pouring from her skin, her eyes, her outstretched hands. Around her, shimmering in the air, were figures, dozens of them, maybe hundreds. They were not ghosts in the traditional sense, not solid or frightening, but presences woven from light and memory. They were the ancestors. Sarah saw the proud warrior with the marks of his tribe. Cato saw the wise woman with eyes that held the history of a people. Hattie saw her own grandmother, who had died on the crossing, her form now whole and radiant. They were a silent chorus, a great cloud of witnesses, their faces filled with a deep, abiding love as they watched their descendant. Mercy's eyes were open, but they were not seeing the clearing. They were seeing everything. They were vast, endless pools of starlight, reflecting a history that stretched back 1,000 years. Her hands were raised, palms open, and from them flowed the light, connecting her to the ancestral spirits that surrounded her. She had become a conduit, a living bridge between the past and the present, the physical and the spiritual. As her friends and family watched, frozen in awe, the communication began. There were no words, no sounds, only a flood of images and emotions that poured from Mercy and the spirits into their own minds. They felt the sun of Africa on their skin. They heard the rhythm of the drums. They saw the vibrant life of a world before the ships. Then came the terror, brutal capture, the suffocating darkness of the hold, the unspeakable loss. They felt the lash, the burn of the sun on the rice fields, the crushing weight of bondage, the generations of pain and sorrow. But then, they felt something else. They felt the resilience, the secret songs, the whispered stories, the faith that would not be extinguished. They saw the small acts of defiance, the shared meal, the protected child, the enduring spirit that refused to be broken. They finally understood. They were a call. They were a manifestation of the immense spiritual power that had lain dormant in their bloodline for generations. A power that Mercy, in her quiet desperation, had finally unlocked. Her prayer for a sign had been answered not with a whisper, but with a thunderclap of the soul. The candles were a symbol of their people's spirit, a light that could not be extinguished by the Master's world, a fire that burned without consuming, a strength that endured without violence. And her disappearance, they saw it now with perfect clarity. She had not been taken. She had not run away. She had chosen. The ancestors had called to her, offering her a different kind of freedom, not an escape to the north, but a journey inward, a transformation into something more. She had walked willingly out of the church, out of the city, out of the world that sought to define her, and into this sacred space to answer that call, to embrace her spiritual destiny. The vision crested, and they saw Mercy's purpose. She was gathering the pain, the strength, the memories of all who had come before her, weaving them into a new kind of power. The story reached its emotional and thematic climax as they witnessed the completion of her personal journey. The quiet, unassuming girl who had prayed for a glimmer of hope had become the hope itself. She was no longer just Mercy Robinson, a slave in Charleston. She was a vessel of the ancestors, a keeper of the flame, a testament to the enduring, unbreakable power of the human spirit. The sense of wonder that had filled them turned to a profound, soul-shaking awe. The themes of ancestry and memory were no longer abstract concepts. They were a living, breathing force, present in this clearing, embodied in this young woman. The hidden sanctuary was not just a place. It was a state of being. And Mercy's transformation was a metaphor for the spiritual awakening of a people. As the light around her pulsed, reaching a blinding intensity, they knew that nothing would ever be the same. The girl who vanished had been found, but the woman they found was someone and something entirely new. The blinding light in the sacred clearing did not recede. It was absorbed. It flowed back into Mercy, a river of starlight returning to its source, until she stood before them, no longer a conduit for 1,000 souls, but a single woman, yet utterly and irrevocably changed. The silver leaves of the ancient trees ceased their shimmering. The impossible flowers folded their luminous petals, and the ethereal music faded back into the steady, familiar chorus of the swamp. The air, which had been charged with the energy of ages, settled into a profound and peaceful stillness. Hattie took a hesitant step forward, her daughter's name a choked whisper on her lips. Mercy. Mercy turned her head, and the eyes that met her mother's were her own, yet they held the depth of the night sky and the wisdom of 1,000 lifetimes. A slow, gentle smile touched her lips, a smile of such profound peace and love that it seemed to heal the very air between them. "I am here, Mama," she said, and her voice was her own, yet it resonated with a new timbre, a quiet authority that was as undeniable as the sunrise. She was no longer the girl who had vanished. She was the woman who had returned. The journey back from the swamp was a silent one, a procession of awestruck disciples following a prophetess. The path that had been so treacherous on the way in now seemed to clear before them, the grasping roots and sucking mud offering no resistance. The menacing sounds of the night were now just the sounds of the world. Stripped of their fearful power, they walked not in terror, but in a state of grace, their steps light, their hearts full of a wonder that was too vast for words. As the first pale fingers of dawn began to streak the eastern sky, they reached the edge of Charleston. The city was just beginning to stir, the first plumes of smoke rising from chimneys, the distant clatter of a cart echoing on the cobblestones. Mercy paused at the boundary between the wildness of the swamp and the rigid order of the city. She looked at the small, loyal group who had followed her, her gaze resting on each of them, a silent acknowledgement of their courage and their faith. "Go home," she said softly. "Tell them what you have seen. Tell them not to be afraid. A new day is dawning." Hattie, Jacob, Elias, and Cato hesitated, unwilling to leave her, but her expression was one of gentle command. They nodded, their eyes shining with unshed tears, and melted back into the shadows of the city, their hearts burning with a story that would change everything. Then, alone, Mercy began to walk. She did not sneak through the back alleys or hug the shadows. She walked down the center of the street, her posture erect, her head held high, her bare feet making a soft, steady rhythm on the stones. Her simple dress was torn and stained from the swamp, yet she wore it like a royal garment. Her presence radiated a quiet, unshakable power, a stillness that drew the eye and silenced the tongue. A baker, stepping out to cool his arms, saw her and froze, the flour dusting his apron seeming to glow in her presence. A milkmaid, her pails balanced on a yoke, stopped dead in the street, her mouth falling open. The word began to spread, a whisper at first, then a murmur, then a cry. "It's her, the girl from the church. It's Mercy!" As she approached the corner of Broad and Meeting Street, a collective gasp rippled through the small crowd that had begun to gather. From inside street, Michael's church, a sound was heard, a soft collective sigh, like 1,000 candles exhaling at once, and then silence. The cold, ethereal glow that had held the church hostage for weeks, the light that had defied snuffers and water and prayer, was gone. The church stood in the gray morning light, dark and silent, its purpose fulfilled. Mercy did not look at it. She continued her walk, her destination clear, her purpose absolute. Her return was not a surrender. It was a declaration. She found Reverend Alistair Blackwood in the nave of his now darkened church. He was standing before the altar, his shoulders slumped, a man defeated by a mystery he could not comprehend. The air was thick with the smell of extinguished wicks and stale, cold air. He heard her soft footsteps and turned, his face a mask of shock and disbelief. The woman from his nightmares stood before him, real and solid, her presence filling the vast, empty space. He instinctively took a step back, his hand making a weak, aborted gesture, as if to ward off a spirit. "You," he breathed, his voice a dry rasp. "You are. What are you?" Mercy looked at him, and in her eyes, he saw not the demonic power he had feared, but a deep, sorrowful compassion that unnerved him more than any fire. "I am Mercy Robinson, Reverend," she said, her voice calm and clear, echoing slightly in the cavernous room. "I am a child of God, the same as you." "The candles," he stammered, pointing a trembling finger towards the altar. "The light, it was you. It was your witchcraft." "It was not witchcraft, Reverend," she corrected him gently. "It was prayer. It was the collected voice of my ancestors, all those who have suffered and endured. It was a light that your world could not extinguish because it was not of your world. It was the fire of the Spirit, a fire that burns but does not consume." She took a step closer, and he flinched, but she stopped, maintaining a respectful distance. "You speak of God's love in this church. You read from a book that speaks of the last being first, and the first being last. But do you believe it? Do you see the Spirit in the people you hold in bondage? Do you hear their prayers, or only their cries of pain?" Blackwood stared at her, his mind reeling. Her words were not an attack. They were a genuine question, and they struck him with the force of a physical blow, shattering the foundations of his righteousness. He had seen these people as property, as souls to be saved, perhaps, but as lesser beings, their spiritual lives a pale imitation of his own. He had never considered the depth of their faith, the power of their history, the strength of a spirit forged in the crucible of unimaginable suffering. I am a man of God," he said weakly, the words sounding hollow even to his own ears. "A man of God, or a man of this Charleston?" Mercy asked, her voice still soft, yet carrying an immense weight. "Your faith is a fortress with high walls, Reverend, built to keep the world out. But God is not in the fortress. God is in the field. God is in the slave quarters. God is in the heart of the woman who prays for a sign and finds she is the sign herself." She looked around the grand, empty church, at the soaring arches and the useless, extinguished candelabras. "You have built a beautiful cage, but the spirit has flown free." He had no answer. He could only stare at the woman before him, this slave girl who spoke with the authority of a prophet, who looked at him not with the fear he expected, but with a profound, heartbreaking pity. He felt his own faith, the rigid, intellectual faith he had cultivated his entire life, begin to crumble, turning to dust in the face of her living, breathing power. He was humbled, not by a demon, but by a truth he had refused to see, a truth embodied in the quiet, powerful woman who had returned from the other side. He had been the shepherd, and she the lost sheep, but now, standing in the ruins of his certainty, he felt utterly and completely lost. The news of Mercy's return and the extinguishing of the candles swept through the enslaved community not like a rumor, but like a revelation. That evening, as dusk settled, they began to gather. They did not go to the church, for the church was no longer the sacred space. They went to the edge of the city, to a wide, fallow field that bordered the swamp, a place that was neither the master's world nor the spirit's, but a space in between. They came in ones and twos, then in dozens, a silent, hopeful tide of people drawn by an unspoken call. Hattie and Cato and the brothers, Jacob and Elias, moved among them, their faces glowing with the secret they now shared, their quiet words of reassurance calming the anxious and bolstering the fearful. When the crowd had swelled to hundreds, a silent, expectant sea of faces illuminated by a few scattered torches, Mercy appeared. She walked into the center of the gathering, and a hush fell. A silence so profound it seemed to draw all the sound from the world. She stood before them, a simple, unassuming figure. Yet she held the attention of every soul present. She began to speak, and her voice, though not loud, carried to the furthest edges of the crowd, each word clear and resonant. "I see you," she began, her gaze sweeping across their faces, meeting the eyes of old men and young children, of field hands and house servants. "I see the weariness in your bones and the sorrow in your hearts. I see the strength you hide from the Master and the hope you whisper in the dark. I am one of you. I am your daughter, your sister, your friend." She told them her story, not as a tale of supernatural terror, but as a journey of the spirit. She spoke of her prayer in the dark church, a simple prayer for a sign. She described the cold fire, not as a curse, but as an answer, a doorway opening. She spoke of the other side, of the ancestors, not as vengeful ghosts, but as a loving, powerful presence, a great river of strength from which they were all drawn. "They told me our story," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "They showed me that we are not just slaves. We are the children of kings and queens, of scholars and builders, of people who knew the names of the stars and the secrets of the earth. That knowledge was stolen from us, but it was not destroyed. It lives in our blood, in our bones, in the rhythm of our hearts. It is a fire that cannot be extinguished." A wave of emotion rippled through the crowd, a collective sigh of recognition and release. The words she spoke were the truths they had always felt, but had never dared to name. "The masters have put us in chains," Mercy continued, her voice rising with a quiet, passionate intensity. "But the strongest chains are the ones we carry in our own minds. The chain of fear, the chain of hopelessness, the chain of believing we are what they say we are. Freedom is not just a place you can run to. Freedom is a place you must build inside yourself. It is knowing who you are. It is remembering where you come from. It is claiming the power that is your birthright." She raised her hands, not in a gesture of command but of offering. "The light in the church is gone, because it is no longer needed there. The light is in you. It is in all of us. We are the flameless fire. We are the light that burns without being consumed. We are the hope that endures in the darkness." Her speech was not a call to arms, not a plan for rebellion in the way the white authorities would understand it. It was a call to a spiritual awakening, a revolution of the soul. As she finished speaking, a sound began to rise from the crowd. It started as a low hum, a single voice, then another and another, until it swelled into a powerful chorus. They were singing an old hymn, but they sang it with a new spirit, a spirit of joy and defiance and liberation. The sound rolled across the fields, a wave of pure, unadulterated power, a testament to the spiritual revival that was being born in that moment. From a distance, on horseback, Sheriff Brody and 2 of his deputies watched the gathering, their faces grim. They could not hear Mercy's words, but they could see her effect. They saw the rapt faces, the tears of joy, the passionate singing. They saw not a prayer meeting, but the beginnings of an uprising. "This has gone on long enough," Brody muttered, his hand resting on the butt of his pistol. "Her influence is becoming a danger. We need to put a stop to this, and we need to do it now." The forces of oppression were gathering to extinguish the light, but they did not understand that this was a fire they could not put out. The story was building to its final confrontation, a clash not of swords, but of worlds. The final notes of the hymn hung in the humid night air, a resonant chord of hope and defiance that rolled across the fallow field and broke against the line of trees where Sheriff Brody and his men sat on their horses. The sound was not triumphant, not a battle cry. It was something far more dangerous, a declaration of inner freedom that his whips and chains could never touch. He saw the hundreds of faces, upturned and illuminated by the flickering torchlight, their expressions transformed from the dull mask of servitude into something bright and alive. This was not a prayer meeting. It was a contagion, and mercy was its source. "This has gone on long enough," Brody muttered, the words a venomous hiss in the dark. He spurred his horse forward, his two deputies fanning out on either side, their movements a practiced, brutal geometry. "Her influence is becoming a danger. We need to put a stop to this, and we need to do it now." The thunder of their hooves on the hard-packed earth was a sudden, violent intrusion into the sacred quiet that had followed the song. The crowd, which had been a single body united in spirit, stirred, a ripple of fear passing through them, but they did not break. They did not scatter. As the horsemen bore down on them, the crowd parted, creating a narrow aisle that led directly to the center where Mercy stood, calm and still. Then, as if guided by a single will, the people flowed back together behind her, forming a silent, unmoving wall of human bodies. They stood shoulder to shoulder, the old and the young, the strong and the frail, their faces set, their eyes fixed on the approaching sheriff. They held no weapons, they uttered no threats. Their resistance was their presence, their unity a silent, unbreakable shield. Brody reined his horse to a skidding halt just feet from the first line of people, the animal snorting and tossing its head, its nervous energy a stark contrast to the stillness of the crowd. "I am the law in this city," Brody bellowed, his voice a raw assertion of power. "I order you to disperse. Return to your quarters at once." His words, which usually sent slaves scattering in fear, fell into the profound silence and were absorbed without effect. No one moved. Their collective gaze was not defiant, not hateful. It was something far more unsettling. It was steady, and it was unafraid. "This is an unlawful assembly," Brody shouted, his frustration mounting, his face purpling in the torchlight. "I will have you all whipped. Do you hear me?" A single voice, calm and clear, answered him from the heart of the crowd. "They hear you, Sheriff," Mercy said, and she began to walk forward, the people parting before her and closing behind her, a living gate opening and shutting. She stopped just behind the front line of her followers, protected by them, yet clearly their leader. "They have heard your voice, and the voice of men like you, every day of their lives. They know the sound of the whip. It is you who does not hear. I have no business with you, girl, except to place you under arrest for inciting this rebellion," Brody snarled, pointing a thick finger at her. "Step forward and surrender yourself, and I may show leniency to the rest of these fools. You see a rebellion," Mercy replied, her voice carrying a sad, gentle wisdom. "We see a congregation. You see fools. I see the children of God. You offer leniency, a brief pause in your cruelty, as if it is a gift. We are not looking for a better cage, Sheriff. We are remembering how to fly. The sheriff, enraged and confounded by her refusal to play by the rules of fear he understood so well, drew his pistol, the metallic click of the hammer being cocked unnaturally loud in the tense silence. I will not be mocked by a slave. I will have order. Hand her over, or by God, I will open fire. At the sight of the pistol, a tremor of fear went through the crowd. A mother pulled her child closer. A young man clenched his fists, but Mercy held up a hand, a simple, calming gesture. His power is in the fear he creates, she said, her voice never rising yet reaching every ear. It is in the belief that his pistol is the strongest thing in this field. Do not give him your fear. It is the only thing he truly owns. She then looked directly at Brody, her eyes meeting his over the heads of her people. You can shoot, she said, her voice dropping to an almost conversational tone. You can whip. You can chain. You can kill the body. But you cannot kill the spirit. You cannot extinguish a fire that has already been lit in 1,000 hearts. Your violence is a loud, angry noise in a world that is learning to listen to the silence. It has no power here anymore. The sheriff was left speechless, his pistol aimed at a wall of people who had simply refused to acknowledge its power. He was a man whose entire world was built on the fulcrum of physical force and intimidation, and in that moment, he found his lever had no place to rest. He was adrift in a sea of quiet conviction, his authority a meaningless title, his weapon a useless piece of metal. He was contemplating the absolute limit of his power, and he was terrified. What happened next would become the heart of the legend. A story told and retold in 100 different ways, its details shifting with each telling but its essence remaining the same. As the standoff reached its breaking point, a sudden, powerful gust of wind swept across the field. It came from nowhere, a great, invisible hand that tore through the clearing, causing the torches to flare violently and then, one by one, to be extinguished. The field was plunged into an almost absolute darkness, the only light coming from the sliver of a moon that was now, for the first time that night, visible through a break in the clouds. In the sudden blackness, there was a moment of collective shock, a sharp intake of breath from the crowd. Then, chaos. Sheriff Brody, his authority shattered, his target vanished, screamed at his men, "Get her, now!" The deputies, disoriented and unnerved, spurred their horses forward, crashing into the front line of the crowd. People cried out, stumbling back, not in panic, but in confusion. The silent, solid wall was broken. For a few heartbeats, the field was a maelstrom of shouting men, frightened horses, and the dark, swirling mass of the crowd. Then, just as suddenly as it began, it was over. The wind died down to a whisper. The moon, as if on cue, shone brighter, casting a pale, silvery light over the scene. The deputies were in the center of the clearing, their horses skittish and wild-eyed, their hands empty. The crowd was reforming, people helping each other to their feet, their faces turned towards the spot where Mercy had been standing. The spot was empty. She was gone. The sheriff and his men searched, their anger turning to a frantic, bewildered disbelief. They stormed through the crowd, peering into faces, their threats now sounding hollow and pathetic. But she was not there. She had not run, for there was nowhere to run to. She had not been captured. She had simply vanished. The people offered no explanation. Some stared at the empty space with expressions of pure, ecstatic awe. Others wept silently, tears of sorrow or of joy. They did not know which. Hattie stood looking up at the moon, a slow, peaceful smile on her face, as if she were watching her daughter ascend into the heavens. The story of that night splintered into a dozen different tales. Some would later swear that the sheriff's men had grabbed her in the darkness and spirited her away to a prison from which she never emerged. Others claimed that a great, dark bird had swooped down and carried her off into the night sky. But the story that took root, the one that was whispered in the slave quarters and hummed in the fields, was that she had not been taken at all. They said that in the moment of darkness, her body had dissolved into pure light, 1,000 tiny sparks that scattered on the wind and settled in the hearts of everyone present. They said she had not been arrested, she had not been killed, she had simply gone home, returning to the spiritual realm from whence she came, her task on earth complete. The ambiguity of her ending was the final, perfect seal on her legend. She had become more than a woman, more than a prophet. She was now a story, a symbol, an eternal flame. The years that followed were hard. The yoke of bondage in Charleston no lighter than before. But something had irrevocably shifted. The fear, though still a constant companion, no longer had the same suffocating power. It was now tempered by a secret, a shared memory of the light. Mercy's story became a currency of hope, a treasure passed down in the dark of night. Her name was never spoken in the presence of the white folk, but her legacy was everywhere. The songs she had taught them were sung in the fields, their lyrics of faith and Jordan's shore now imbued with a deeper, more potent meaning. They were songs of spiritual resistance, a declaration of a freedom that could not be chained. Decades passed. The war came and went, and the physical chains were broken. But the struggle for true freedom, the struggle of the soul, continued. Hattie, now a very old woman with skin like wrinkled parchment and eyes that had seen the world change, would gather her grandchildren and great-grandchildren around her on the porch of her own small, free home. She would tell them the story, her voice a low, mesmerizing chant, and the candles, they burned, but with no flame. She would say, her eyes looking at something far away, "It was a cold fire, children. It was the fire of the Spirit. It was our light, a light they couldn't put out." Her great-granddaughter, a young girl with eyes as deep and contemplative as Mercy's own, would listen, her heart pounding. The story was not just a story to her. It was a living thing. She could feel it, a warmth spreading through her chest, a quiet strength taking root in her soul. The final scene of the legend was not in a field under the moon. It was here, in the heart of a child. The voices of future generations were keeping the story alive. And with it, the legacy. Mercy's final words had not been a call to arms, but a promise that the struggle for freedom is never-ending, but that the human spirit, once ignited, will always, always endure. The final, triumphant image was not of a vanishing woman, but of a young girl, her face illuminated by the glow of a story, feeling the first warm flicker of that same flameless fire awakening within her, a legacy not of memory,